Welcome once again to the second of our third season of FIPP Insider webinars. A couple of weeks ago, we concluded our digital subscriptions masterclass series with Mather Economics, and next week we're going to be looking at the future of content with Will Roth from Meredith's The Foundry, as we continue to bring the latest media news, insight and analysis. A reminder, of course, that all of our work is only possible thanks to the support of our members and our sponsors. And I'd like to highlight in particular our corporate partners, UPM, Press Reader and Zephyr. A big thank you to all of them. Now, one of our contributors said last year that we've reached the end of the beginning of the digital media era. And this initial phase has thrown up four undoubted winners, both socially and economically. Google, Amazon, Apple and Facebook dominate our lives, certainly in the Western world anyway, with our continued intensive use of their services, giving them access to data about every aspect of our lives. This has in turn led to accusations that these companies are abusing their dominant market positions in a whole variety of ways, and today we're going to explore the issues around the positions that these companies have built up and look at the efforts being taken by governments around the world to regulate them. Now, you can, of course, ask questions throughout today's session using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll keep an eye on that, and we will, of course, be putting the recording on our YouTube channel, FIPP World, once the event has finished. Now, I'm delighted to be joined today by an absolute expert in this field. He is the CEO of Digital Content Next, spends a large proportion of his time working on lobbying efforts in Washington and elsewhere. He is, of course, Jason Kint. Welcome, Jason.
Hi, James. Good morning. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. And thank you very much for joining us, and great to have you here. I'm just going to put you back on my screen so I can see you. There we go. Welcome to FIPP Insider. You've been obviously a regular on our stage at our events over the years, but I think this is the first time we've done a webinar together. So for our viewers who may be new to Digital Content Next, can you just tell us a little bit about what you guys do and who you represent?
Absolutely, James. So we're the Association for the Premium Publishers, the digital content companies. We're based here in the States, out of New York, and we have about 75 premium publishers that range across magazine, newspapers, television, and what we call pure play digital companies. And so we do normal association work for everyone from the New York Times to Disney to Vox Media to Meredith. Thanks for having me.
No, pleasure. And now you guys are very active in lobbying, as I mentioned in the introduction, particularly with the US government. I know you work also with the EU, and much of that is focused on the activities of the big tech companies. So I wonder if you could start really by laying out the key areas of challenge as you see them, that you see in the business models of Google, Amazon, Apple, and of course, particularly Facebook.
Yeah, absolutely. So our core mission is to, what we say, advance the future of trusted content. And yes, we like to think of ourselves a bit as a think tank, but also the advocacy arm to put those thoughts to work and drive change in the industry to make sure we can fund premium content going forward, as you so well work on too. We look across those four companies in the main areas. We see certainly competition and antitrust has been a core area for us, more focused on Google and Facebook going back 3-4 years, and we're now starting to see a lot of the fruits of that work. Apple more recently, and Amazon would be the fourth company. Content licensing, copyright would be another area beyond antitrust that really applies to all the companies. And then I would also add kind of the technical things that are happening, like the death of the third-party cookie, that also plays a bit into privacy issues. So, and then I should say, especially in the same week of the elections here in the U.S., anything that impacts democracy too, and the important work that news and entertainment companies do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the timing is very relevant to all of those things. And I guess that really picks up on one of the aspects of this, which is that we should distinguish between the challenge that these companies present to our society more generally and the challenges that they present to our industry specifically. What do you think is the biggest priority in each of those areas, the societal challenge and the media industry challenge?
From the societal challenge, and really everything hits a societal challenge. There is so much good that has come from the tech platforms. It's well documented. I think when we took on this campaign a few years ago, There was certainly a halo over anything and everything they were doing, if you will. They, all the positives were well documented. The ability to get content, within seconds. But the distribution challenges as things have become more and more automated, and the public and advertisers, I should say, have not always known who to trust. They don't always know where the content's coming from. the brand, the brand as a proxy for trust, if you will, has been lost a bit. And so society, I think, has been affected for sure, because without knowing where the truth is on the news side, or where to get high quality content, how that gets funded, you have an erosion of trust. And so I think that's the key area that I would just highlight in that question.
What about for the media industry? What do you think is the biggest challenge for us?
Well, then it applies to the funding side, right? So if you're not getting fair exchange for the value of the content, and certainly as we move to the digital world, it's been documented that we're sometimes getting pennies instead of dollars, either from the ad market or for the licensing of content. So for the media industry, we had to learn, to continue to embrace the change. Automation and the efficiencies and the access are only going to continue to evolve, and in many ways are good things for us, right? They've made it possible for us to create media as we are right now, from across an ocean this easily. So there's lots of good that's come from this evolution, but the fair exchange of value, how does the publisher maintain the price of their content, either with consumers or licensing? How do they maintain the value of that media for the advertiser, so that their media can't be just can't be captured cheaper elsewhere? And the value of the data and that direct, I think one of the key things media companies have always capitalized on is they have some sort of direct relationship with that consumer or the advertiser. It's typically built off of trust. It's a direct relationship. And so now we live in a world of intermediaries where the data can be captured by people you don't even know that's happening, and the media can be repurposed without necessarily the media company's permission. And so that also erodes the value.
Yeah, this question of intermediation and lack of transparency, I think we'll come back to that a little bit later as well. I guess with what's going on this week, we've got to really start with that question of the impact on democracy, one of the societal challenges that you laid out there. Pretty blunt question. Do you think that Facebook and Twitter will have had a distorting effect on this year's US presidential election? Or too soon to tell?
I don't think it's too soon to tell, James. Twitter, I've well documented, I'm sure, in the public sphere, but Twitter made more positive changes, I think, and I think that there are negatives with the Twitter platform from an anonymity perspective that I think make things a little bit more challenging sometimes. But in terms of getting out front and making higher risk political decisions, I think higher risk business decisions for the purpose of public trust, I think Twitter has done a better job than they did in 2016 for sure. And they've been willing to, we're in a place now where they will put a label on the president of the United States within minutes when something is false or threatening to democracy or the elections. So I think that's we should note that. That's a milestone, and that's a part of them really, I think, having the backbone to do what's right for society, despite the political and maybe business risks in doing that. Facebook, I'll be much more harsh on. I mean, I think, they've continued to execute on what we saw prior to the 2016 election, which is it seems they only want to do the minimum amount that they have to do without creating more political risk or business risk for their company. And to be fair, they are a shareholder-driven company, and their responsibility to their shareholders is to maximize their financials. And so I think they've certainly done that. But with that, they've failed to make some of those same decisions that Twitter has done. I'll just hit on two. They didn't eliminate micro-targeting of political advertising as Twitter and Google did for the election. And they also have been unwilling to slow down content. We can talk more about it, but they've allowed their algorithms to amplify some really harmful content. So, and we also have to recognize that Facebook's audience is orders of magnitude larger than Twitter's too. So it has a much larger impact. So I'm quite disappointed in Facebook as a company, and that will go through, I'm sure, the next month too.
Do you think that with Facebook, do you think that's driven by a sense that the political impact of Facebook is a sort of irritating annoyance to what they see as their main business, which is something else? In other words, with Twitter, it's much easier to see how news and current affairs and the fact that their user base is made up of so many influential people that it's inevitable that news and media is going to play a big part in their policy-making decisions. With Facebook, do you get the sense that they're just a bit irritated by the fact that they're in the political process? It's not really what they want to do? Or is that an unfair characterization?
I get that feeling. I know what you're saying, and we hear it also with news, right? Where you'll hear that, well, maybe they'll just block all news, or they'll get out of the news distribution business altogether. They've even made that threat when they've had regulation turning on them. But news is what brings people back to a platform. It's the most current content. It's also what creates a media environment in many ways. So I think without that news or political content, Facebook would be a different animal. If Facebook was just user-generated content of birthdays and random posts without the currency of news, then it becomes more like a message board, if you will, or a Reddit or something. So I think they know it's important to their business. I just think that they also are. I think they're very sensitive to upsetting the whoever's in power at any given nation, and I think they're sensitive in upsetting the base and the public that supports that person in power. And there's been well documented reports, not just in India and Vietnam and the Philippines, about Facebook getting too close to governments and possibly it affecting their decisions. But it's been documented now in the United States, the relationship between Facebook and the U.S. government, and it's worrisome, very worrisome.
We're potentially entering, as we're recording this, we don't yet know who the president is going to be. Of course, by the time this appears on YouTube, that will have become apparent, we hope. We could potentially enter a period now of a number of years with Trump in opposition, let's say. That's one possible outcome, where the flaws that are in the system that were identified in 2016 could be amplified by him being even more vocal about an election that he feels was, let's say, stolen from him, or whatever characterization he wants to put around it. Do you think we've learned any of those lessons of 2016, either as consumers or as the platforms, or are there still fundamental flaws in our approach to the way that content is used and distributed?
I don't think we've learned the lessons yet, and I think that the necessary changes are difficult to the business model of a social network like Facebook. And the part that is the most difficult change, it's because it's really what their business model is built off of, is the issues that come with micro-targeting of individuals, whether it be with advertising content or news content, so that individuals have a personalized view, and there's no ability for anyone else to see what the other person's seeing. We all live in our own little individual world, and that is a wonderful, personalization is a wonderful service and creates a lot of good. But when you connect that to elections or news and information, it really breaks down some of the fundamentals of the public sphere, and that's a challenge. And I think it's a problem with Facebook's core business model intersecting with news and politics. If you don't know what I'm seeing on a daily basis, and you're seeing a entirely different set of ads or information, we're living in our own little bubbles, and there's no counter speech, if you will. There's no ability for the public to have a water cooler discussion, if you will, and that's problematic.
I mean, related to that, you've been very vocal about the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and you've been following that very, very closely. Just tell everybody why, in the context of microtargeting, that was such a big deal.
That was a big deal. In the issue of microtarget is a big deal because you had a documented issue where the personal data of millions of people was then sold, according to the records. It was sold by a third party to Cambridge Analytica, and it was taken without the public being aware, or really they're outside their expectations, if you will. And then that data was used to micro-target ads to those users in a political election, at least in the United States, and there's still debate about, where else. But in the United States, it was used alongside Facebook employees inside of the Trump campaign to micro-target individuals with ads. And then your Channel 4 news just, a few months ago actually had a new documentary showing how it was used to suppress Black American voters, at a micro-targeted level in certain locations to keep them from voting. So, you get in some very, very core issues of democracy pretty quickly when you don't have any sort of constraints on the use of data.
Yeah, and for those who are watching, if you want to know more about that scandal, Jason and DCN have done some great work on there, particularly in aggregating other sources. Definitely worth looking at that. It's a really crucial issue. Let's just move on to another aspect of the impact that these platforms have on democracy, which is lobbying. This is not very widely reported, or it's not reported very often anyway. You're well placed to tell us, how much of an impact do the lobbying efforts of Facebook and the others have on the legislative process? I mean, are they actively involved?
Absolutely. Facebook in the last few years has increased its lobbying efforts enormously, and Google's, depending on the quarter, is the biggest lobbyist outside of possibly a couple unrelated industries. So they have significant influence, and I think what's changed, and certainly they've increased that over the last 3 or 4 years, the amount of money they're spending. The effect of it, I think, has actually probably gone down a bit, and they've become more reliant on their resources and money, and they've had less of that. I mentioned earlier, I think, a halo that they had over their companies. If you turn back the clock to like 2014, 2012, when Google had an antitrust investigation going on at that time, they really were seen as the companies that, particularly Google, that everybody wanted to have relationships with in Washington. And if you were in academia or a think tank, it was the best money you could get. So their money went a long way at that point, and everybody only saw the good in the technology. And I think what changed in 2016, and certainly around that period too, because of the good work that was being done in Europe, I think Europe's been ahead of the United States for a number of years here now, is people started to understand how that those tech companies could also be used for bad or to cause business issues for other folks. So that money probably doesn't go as far as it used to, but they are a massive, massive lobby in Washington. And I think even like, you asked me about Cambridge Analytica, but when Facebook started to have its challenges, let's call it that was beginning of 2018, but even really coming out of the election, at that point, they didn't really start to have pressures like they should have had, where companies had kind of covered up, if you will, I'll use that language, because they had an issue for multiple years that they didn't tell the public about. They didn't really receive the treatment that they should have received for that. And I think that was due to the amount of relationships and money that they were throwing around Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to talk a little bit later on about the relative impact of the US and the EU as well, which is good that you mentioned that. We mentioned at the start of the show that the fact that these businesses have built up these monopoly positions in their respective industries. We've had 2 actions on this from the US government in recent months, the House Judiciary Report and the US DOJ case against Google. And even I, in our prep call, got those 2 confused. So for those who are not familiar. Just describe what each of those are.
Yeah, the House report is from our Congress, from our Parliament, and that was a 1.5 year investigation of the 4 major tech companies that we've talked about: Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Apple. And it was a fairly comprehensive antitrust report that came out last month, and we can talk about some of the key findings there. But that's a report from our Congress, which will lead to probably more hearings. It has some recommendations on it for updating the antitrust laws. So there can be change to law that comes out of it, but that goes into the lawmaking process, which can take a lot of time. Then separately, the Department of Justice, so our federal government, has been investigating Google for more than a year and launched a lawsuit just a few weeks ago into antitrust behavior, anti-competitive behavior by Google. That is immediately an issue for Google, and I think could have more profound impact. It's narrowly focused, and we can talk about the focus, but it could, and it's expected to add in additional areas as they continue to move forward with the lawsuit investigations. And then I think also it's worth mentioning that there's almost all 50 of our states' attorneys general, we call them our attorneys general, the top law person from each state, are all working together on investigations of both Google and Facebook. And they have about a dozen of them, I think 11, filed jointly with our Justice Department against Google. So, and that's not going to change at all, James. I think, regardless of how our election plays out in the winter, you're going to find that whether it be the Justice Department, the states, the Congress, and also the FTC, our other federal regulator who's investigating Facebook, they've got their hands on a lot of interesting evidence, and I think will continue to be filing lawsuits.
Just tell us. I think people were a little bit disappointed by the scope of the lawsuit, weren't they? The DOJ lawsuit. Just describe what the scope of it is. It's, as you say, it's quite narrow. But what does it cover? It's really focused on search and even more narrowly a bit the exclusionary conduct of Google paying and using commercial relationships to require Google search as the default. So Google pays, north of, I don't think we have an exact number, but north of $10 billion a year to Apple to be the default search on Safari and some of Apple's other products. They pay Mozilla, Firefox. So using their position in the market to exclude other search companies. But it does hint at, deeper in the lawsuit, it hints at how they're able to use their monopoly in search for other interests that go beyond search. And that's where it becomes really interesting. And as you think about how Android as the dominant operating system, Chrome as the dominant browser, and then Google's, and probably most important to publishers, I would say, how Google's dominance throughout the entire advertising stack is able to leverage what's underneath that monopoly to dominate search. I mean, dominate advertising too. And I would only say, and obviously I'm not privy to exactly where the lawsuits will go. Yeah. They've been asking a lot of questions about the advertising marketplace and well beyond the search advertising marketplace. And the states also are very close to launching a lawsuit on the advertising side of Google's business too. So just expect there's going to be, kind of a rolling thunder, if you will, of announcements and lawsuits that go well beyond that narrow scope. I mean, on the top level aspects of that, the search embedding piece, that should be pretty much the same point, shouldn't it? We went through this before with Microsoft and Internet Explorer. Is this not exactly the same argument? It's very similar, for sure. And on top of that, I hinted at, but in Brussels, there's been 3 suits that have been won against Google, and one of them was around exactly, it was, wasn't exclusionary context specifically, but it was around search. So, there's, and in Australia and in the UK with the Competition Markets Authority. So there's
there's a lot of investigations that have happened, and there's been suits that have been won already. And I think importantly, that work is all being looked at globally more than ever. So I think we're in a different place than the Microsoft suit even.
But you sound pretty optimistic that at some point this will actually result in some meaningful action against these firms.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it will. I think the operative words are at some point, and there are media businesses that are being affected every day by the way the marketplace is working, and have to make the decision of, everybody has to be in business with Google. So it's a difficult environment to live in while you wait.
I mean, just looking lastly on this issue, looking at Facebook has this bizarre relationship with these kind of investigations, don't they? Isn't it right that Mark Zuckerberg can't actually travel to certain countries because he's under the risk of arrest if he goes to Canada and various other places?
Yeah, I mean, it ultimately depends on the courage of the governments, but there is a period where I think he had much higher risk. I think it might have died off a bit because of just time, but he was summoned and subpoenaed by both UK Parliament and Canadian Parliament, and threatened that if he landed, he'd have to testify or yes. So it's very bizarre place to be when one of the most powerful and wealthy people in the world does not have to be responsible to any parliaments around the world and that represent the public. It's unfortunate.
Yeah, it's almost a situation you can't imagine any other business ever getting into. I can't imagine the CEO of Shell, getting himself in a position where he would be arrested. Anyway, we digress. Just lastly on that monopoly question, before we move on to privacy, do you kind of subscribe to the view that, and actually this was something that Scott Galloway expressed at one of your conferences, that it will be the economic pressures rather than the regulatory ones that'll break up people like Google and Facebook, that the bits are worth more than the whole? He uses that great stat, WhatsApp is the biggest telecommunications company in the world. How much bigger could it be if it wasn't within Facebook's control? Do you think that's a valid view?
I probably won't last long if I disagree with Scott too much, but he's normally right on everything. I don't think that they get to that point as companies without the regulatory pressure. I mean, I understand his point, and I understand the skepticism for certain with federal government around these companies, that they're almost too big for any government to tame. But I still think the decisions are driven by regulatory risk being applied before they make it purely based on economic risk. So an example is, I think Scott would probably say that Facebook's worth more if Instagram wasn't part of Facebook. Instagram's, probably worth more than the core Facebook app now. Facebook, loves to have the moat around that business and the power that comes with it, and having a single executive that's, basically an autocrat over it. I don't see them leaving that scenario without the risk. There's antitrust decisions that have started to play out where Facebook and Instagram can't share data across their apps anymore, for instance. Well, if that's the case, if Facebook and Instagram can't be interoperable, then I think you get to the point where you say, let's break these up. Let's divest one, because at that point, but that's due to regulatory risk. So that's the only thing I would, I guess, disagree with a bit.
That's a good point. Let's look now at consumer privacy. I mean, this wasn't really at the forefront of people's minds, I guess, until GDPR and some of these other recent pieces of legislation started coming out. There's a bunch of new legislation coming down the track. We're going to talk about the one that passed yesterday, the California law, in a minute. But just give everybody an idea of what else is out there on the horizon that might affect their businesses in years to come. I mean, publishers did a ton of work to get ready for GDPR. What's the next set of work that they're going to have to do to get ready for the next piece of legislation?
Well, I think a new update to the e-privacy regulation, which still isn't completed in Europe, I think just came out a new draft. So that's in process, and I think the European folks probably are even closer to that than we are. But in the States, you're at a place where the federal law just failed for better part of a decade, and the industry didn't self-regulate at the level it needed, and there's been an erosion of trust that's led to ad blocking and privacy concerns and all sorts of issues. And so now the government's catching up, and we have a law in California now that was just enhanced as part of the elections on Tuesday that will go into effect in the future. CCPA was the original law, and now there's what's called CPRA, and that's California. California, to put in perspective, is essentially the law of the land now in the states, based both on size and commercial activities. And so there are other state laws that are coming out, but what you're going to see, regardless of the government over 2021 in the next administration, you're going to see incredible pressure on the federal government to pass a privacy law that that preempts or at least applies some certainty across the states in America. So, because having just a patchwork of state laws is problematic, and so unless you can get to a point where there's a federal law that preempts the state law so that you can have a single law, then it makes things more difficult, particularly for small business.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you wrote an article about the impact of that California privacy law recently, and you described it as not perfect but well-intentioned. I mean, what did you mean by that?
Well, the interesting about the California law that passed on Tuesday is that there were consumer groups that were opposed to it, and there were industry groups that, particularly the big tech companies, that I think would have loved for it just to go away and not even be on the ballot, which is normally the case with good law, right? You've got people on both sides of the debate that have issues with it. The law was going to pass. It was being asked of the California public, do you want more privacy? Of course, regardless of the lobbying efforts, it was going to pass. And I think for the most part, it keeps with the general intention of giving consumers what they would expect. When what the consumer groups didn't probably like about it is that it allows a publisher to still charge money for its service and charge a different rate if the user opts out of giving permission for their data to be sold and shared. But there's trade-offs there, and I wrote about it in the piece, and anybody can read that if they will. And then I think people didn't love the fact it was opt-out, right? Where GDPR is more of an opt-in, but I know the thinking behind that is that instead of blanking users every time they go to a site or app to try to get their consent, instead the law assumes that when you choose to use a website or an app, that there's certain purposes that your data is going to be used, and that's completely reasonable and in line with your expectations. And so if you're on the New York Times app or website, if they use your data to personalize the content or to fulfill your billing and subscription, that's reasonable and expected by the user.
Yeah.
But you can then opt out globally and just say, I don't want my data to be sold or shared across multiple sites or apps. There's trade-offs there, but you need a law.
Yeah, absolutely. The one we got. Now, you at DCN, you've put your support behind this new initiative, the Global Privacy Standard. Just tell us a bit more about that, why it's important.
That's just a new standard that's now, it's in draft and being discussed at W3C now too, that allows at the browser level or an extension in the browser or any participant in the marketplace to set a simple signal that the user doesn't want to be tracked. They want a single controller, if you will. So the site or app that they are intentionally using, they can do what they want with their data, but please don't have some other party that I'm not even choosing to interact with then take my data and use it for their own purposes. So it's important because it's a simple and effective choice mechanism. It actually aligns, I think, pretty well with publishers' interests and avoids some of the other collateral damage that could happen if we didn't have control over it. And probably most importantly, it actually was a requirement of the California law. And so we thought better to be involved in designing it than to let the California government tell us how it's going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. Fair enough. Just on the question, the final thing on the question of privacy, do you think that consumers understand privacy? Do you think they understand how their data is being collected and being used?
No, I know we've asked them. So much of the way that the data, whether it be their web activities or their location, is collected across the web. So when they're not using a product is when it's being collected. They don't know that. It's completely outside their expectations. They don't know that a majority of Google and Facebook's data collection happens when you're not using Google or Facebook's products. According to your CMA investigation in the UK, they think Google and Facebook collect a lot of data on them when they search or when they use Facebook's app, but they don't know that a majority of it is collected when they're not actually choosing to use Facebook or Google's products. So whether or not that's per se privacy to them, that's an enormous amount of economic value that is not aligned with the choices the user's making, and that ultimately erodes trust. And I think that's partially bad for publishers too, and I think that's why we've cared so much about the issue.
Yeah, it feels like the next great scandal that's waiting to happen, or waiting to break into public consciousness, doesn't it, about the way in which data is collected and used. Let's narrow down onto an issue of particular importance to publishers, which you mentioned earlier, which is this question of copyright and paying for content. Now, Google have started a couple of initiatives in Germany, France, and Brazil. I've heard these described by some of our publisher members as a preemptive moves to stop regulation, where they're starting to pay news providers for content appearing on Google. Is it something we should welcome, that move?
I don't think so. It's as an industry. Let me speak as an industry. As an individual publisher, all these deals to license publisher content, whether it be Google more recently, or Facebook News Tab last year, Apple. These are Apple less so because it's a revenue sharing deal of the subscription, but it is a recognition of the economic value of the content, right? They're actually starting to get paid. So let's recognize that that's a positive development. And certainly there are a lot of publishers that getting a little bit of extra money for what they're doing from the big tech platforms can be a difference in being able to save, actual employees in the newsroom. Yeah. So I don't want to ignore that. But at the same time, I'm also quite cynical about what's actually happening here, which is that governments are finding antitrust behavior against Google, for instance, through multi-year investigations in Australia and in Europe, and Google is throwing out what sounds like a lot of money, $1 billion over 3 years, to basically, and if you look at what's been reported in the actual terms, these publishers signing on to a deal that says, here's my content, I'll take the millions, and I have to give up all this economic value if I participate in any sort of lawsuit against you as a company. And so it's fairly evident that they're using their resources to buy out publishers and try to shut down any sort of regulatory pressures that are going to affect them more largely.
This is quite a neat virtuous circle from their point of view, isn't it? You destroy a publisher's business model, and then you pay them some of the value that you've taken out, not to sue them for it. So you sue them for it.
Yep, and you only have to pick off a handful, right? Because if you get a few in, then everybody else is going to come along, including normally the long tail of the internet. So, yeah, and it's particularly problematic in news where content's a little bit more replaceable in real time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very worrying thing. What's your view? You mentioned Australia. What's your view on that approach, where the government has forced Google to do that, and it's a little bit more of an aggressive move by a governmental agency? Do you think that's a bit more of a positive step?
I think absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's great news, and it's focused on the recognition of the value of trusted news, as you read through it. So it's recognizing the value to society of news. It started out as a voluntary code, and Google very clearly demonstrated, according to the government, they didn't engage in any good faith. So now the government's stepping in and mandating it, which I think is good, and it gives leverage to the marketplace, to something that's critical to society. And it's it's optional still for the publisher. If the publisher chooses not to engage, then they have that choice. But having the government at the negotiating table with you, I think, is generally a positive right now based on the record of Google.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, a lot of what we talked about today is through the lens of US efforts at regulation, but I wanted to ask, to what extent does the US government still lead in the field of regulation, and how much is it guided by other international governments and institutions? And I'm thinking particularly of the EU. Where's the kind of balance of power sitting at the moment, in your view?
I think Europe's led for the last few years, particularly Brussels, and at least around privacy and around copyright and around, copyright is released to digital publishing, particularly news, and then around antitrust. And so, I think there are moves being made in Washington here, and that's, more early stages, but I think they wouldn't be happening without the pressures that have come out of Europe. So I'll give Europe credit for that. And I think that's helped, right? And there was an attempt by Google's lobbying to frame those efforts in Europe as protectionism for Europe because they didn't have their own Google. But I think that was fairly evident on its face that was, not going to fly. And a lot of the downstream harms of the marketplace were starting to hit the various stakeholders in America. And so, so I think now the U.S. is catching up. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you in a minute to close by giving us 3 things to watch out for in 2021, or 2 or 3 things, depending on what you think is relevant. But before I do that, I just wanted to ask you, how much of this regulatory environment is a product of asymmetrical experience and information? I mean, we've seen here in the UK let's describe it charitably as tremendous difficulties that the government have had in getting a track and trace scheme up and running. Using technology that's widely available. Is it fair to say that lawmakers and governments don't really understand these businesses and the challenges that they represent, and that's what's causing a lot of the difficulty here?
Yeah, no, I think it is for sure, and I think you want limited government involvement, particularly on the lawmaking side, for that reason. These are fast-moving markets that, if you don't really understand them, you can actually cause more harm. But I think what has changed and is changing that I think also we should note is that both on the regulatory side, and so we're seeing this with the Justice Department and the FTC, but then also even on the lawmaker side, you've got a whole new set of participants in government that are younger. I'm in a bias towards age, which I shouldn't do, but they've grown up with digital. They've grown up with social media. They actually really, really understand it better than somebody who adopted it in their 20s or 30s or 40s, or some of the people in Congress probably in their 50s or 60s. So I'm not going to pick on any individual member of Congress, but if you're pushing 70 or 80 years old, the idea that you're going to be able to, write policy or ask questions of companies that have been around for 10 or 15 years, I just think that's difficult, right? And now you've got members of the government that are in their 30s, lawmakers that are literally in their 30s that they only have known Facebook as their way for communicating. So I think that's quite interesting. I think that plays out throughout their staff and everybody that engages in that discussion in Washington. And I think that's been a dramatic change in the last few years. And also the more hearings we have and the more investigations we have, I think everybody gets smarter, frankly, too. Everybody in the discussion, including us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, Jason, we're approaching the end of our time, of our allotted 45 minutes. That's a fantastic comprehensive overview, I think, of the challenges that these businesses are facing and the current legislative environment. Just close by giving everybody 2 or 3 things to watch out for in 2021 in this space.
I think we've talked about a lot of the concerns of government and regulation, et cetera. But I think I would look out for next year, I look out for a lot more economic value and for both publishers' data and the direct relationship that they have with the user, so and their brands. And so, as much as we're coming out of, and hopefully soon coming out of the economic challenges of the pandemic that's hitting the various marketplaces, the most important asset that a lot of our members are sitting on is their brand and relationship with their users. And there'll be a lot of money that will want to pour back into that growth, whether it be, we're seeing it right now with video, with the video marketplace, which has been totally disrupted. And it's quite interesting to look at. And so, there's a lot of economic value in the content creators right now that's going to be needed as we kind of, get back to normal next year. Hopefully earlier rather than later. So anyway, the economic value, I would expect significantly more, like I said, more lawsuits of Facebook and Google and potentially Apple too, in the United States, and particularly if you have a Democratic administration on top of the current House, and the state AGs are quite bipartisan on their efforts. So I think I'd expect that. Those would be the two things, I guess, that stand out. And then, I'd like to believe that, and this is more of a broad point, but with new presidents coming into the U.S. and coming out of probably the most volatile elections of our time, that there'll be a renewed focus on trust and kind of bringing us back together again as a society as much as we can, because a lot of the issues we've been talking about create polarization and other problems, and trust is built when people are vulnerable and when things are bad. And so there's a lot of opportunity, I think, coming out of this election for that, and I think news and entertainment plays a vital role in that.
Well, listen, Jason, we're at the end of our time. Thank you so much for your fantastic insight into this wonderful topic. Really appreciate that. Just tell everybody how they can learn more about Digital Content Next if they want to go and have a look at your work.
Thank you. Digitalcontentnext.org is our site. You can email any of us, myself included, first name at digitalcontentnext.org, and we're at DCN.org on Twitter. Okay?
Fantastic. Definitely worth following both Jason and DCN on Twitter. Jason will give you everything you need to know on Twitter about this subject over the course of the next few months. And the links to that are also in the chat box if you want to have a look at that, as is the link to the FIPP World YouTube channel, where this video will appear in a few days' time, and also a link there to sign up for the newsletter. If you've not already done so, please go and do that. So we're out of time. Thank you very much, Jason. Really appreciate your time and your effort, and we will see you again soon and see all of you soon as well. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you. Take care.